After I came home from my best friend's funeral, I noticed something about my wife that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Evelyn had stopped eating. Not skipped a meal or two because she was grieving. I mean, she had almost completely lost interest in food. Week after week, I watched the woman I had loved for nearly 4 decades become thinner, weaker, and quieter. I took her to doctor after doctor, hoping someone would finally tell me what was wrong. 7 doctors later, I still had no answer. Every test came back normal. Then, out of desperation, I hired a private cook to prepare the meals Evelyn had once loved. I didn't know that decision would expose something happening inside my own home. If this story already has your heart racing, welcome. I'm glad you're here at Heartline Narratives. Before we go further, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Your country, your city. I read your comments and I always love knowing where these stories reach. This story contains fictional elements for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental, but the message behind this story is one worth remembering. My name is Richard Hayes. I was 65 years old when all of this began the evening I returned home from Dayton. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours. My back hurt, my eyes were exhausted, and all I wanted was to see Evelyn. My best friend James had been buried that morning. He had been part of my life for more than 40 years, and standing beside his grave had left me feeling as though something permanent had disappeared from the world. It was early September, and the trees along our driveway were beginning to turn amber around the edges. Normally, Evelyn would have noticed that before anyone else. She loved autumn and always joked that the trees were showing off before winter arrived. But when I opened the front door that evening, the house felt strangely silent. The lamps in the sitting room were off. Evelyn always turned them on before 4. I found her sitting in her favorite armchair beside the window. A book was open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was simply staring toward the lawn. "Hey," I said softly, "I'm home." She turned toward me and smiled. Something inside me tightened. It looked like Evelyn's smile, the same slight lift at the corner of her mouth, but it didn't feel like hers. There was no warmth behind it. "How was the drive?" she asked. "Long." I crouched beside her chair. "Evelyn, are you okay?" "I'm fine. I just didn't sleep much last night." I wanted to tell her about James. I wanted to tell her how strange the funeral had felt, how empty the drive home had been. But she turned back toward the window, and somehow I couldn't find the words. At dinner, Victoria and Daniel were there. Victoria had prepared pasta with cream sauce, and Daniel tried to keep the conversation light. Everyone ate except Evelyn. She picked up her fork, held it for several seconds, then quietly placed it back beside her plate. "Mom, you should eat something," Daniel said. "I'm not very hungry tonight." I looked at her plate, then I looked at Victoria for just a second. I noticed something in my daughter's expression when Evelyn pushed the food away. It was barely there, a quick glance, a tiny movement at the corner of her mouth, then it disappeared. At the time, I told myself I had imagined it. It was wrong, and I wouldn't understand how wrong I was until months later. The next morning, I called our family doctor before I had even finished my coffee. I told him Evelyn wasn't eating, that she had lost weight, that she barely left her room, and that something about her behavior had changed. He told me it was probably grief. I wanted to believe him. James had just died after all. Maybe Evelyn was simply mourning in her own way. But as the weeks passed, grief stopped being an explanation and started feeling like an excuse I was using because I was afraid of the truth. The first doctor said her blood work looked fine. The second suggested an iron supplement. The third ordered scans and neurological tests. Nothing explained why my wife, who had once been awake before everyone else, now stayed in bed until almost noon. Nothing explained why she had stopped calling her friends, stopped tending the roses, and stopped opening the books she used to read every night. By the time we saw the 7th doctor, Evelyn had lost nearly 15 pounds. I sat across from the specialist and tried to keep my voice calm. "She isn't herself," I said. "She doesn't eat. Her hands shake. She doesn't want to see anyone. She doesn't even seem interested in the things she used to love." The doctor looked through the test results again. "Mr. Hayes, medically speaking, your wife is in fairly good condition for her age." I stared at him. "Fairly good?" He nodded. Then he suggested that Evelyn might benefit from speaking with a therapist. I walked out before he finished. When October arrived, I received a call from Daniel. His voice sounded strained. His real estate business in Stamford had collapsed, and he and Victoria were struggling financially. They wanted to move into our house temporarily, he explained, so they could help take care of Evelyn while they got back on their feet. I agreed almost immediately. At the time, I thought having family around would help. They arrived that Saturday with 2 cars full of luggage. Within a week, Victoria had reorganized the pantry, changed the housekeeper's routine, and memorized every medication Evelyn was taking. She told me it was important to keep everything predictable. Too much activity could make Mom worse, she explained one morning. It sounded reasonable. Then she mentioned Peggy. "Peggy Caldwell keeps calling," Victoria said casually. "I've been letting Mom rest instead of disturbing her." That afternoon, I asked Evelyn about Peggy. "Have you spoken to her lately?" Evelyn looked at me strangely. "No, she hasn't called." I immediately thought of Victoria. Something passed across Evelyn's face, but it vanished so quickly that I couldn't identify it. I told myself I was imagining things, but Evelyn continued getting weaker. One evening, I found her standing alone in the kitchen, staring at the stove. She had cooked in that kitchen for more than 3 decades. "Evelyn," she turned toward me. "I used to make chicken soup here," she whispered. "The one with your mother's dumplings." She nodded. "I don't remember how anymore." That sentence broke something inside me. That night, I sat alone in my study and made a decision. I wasn't going to take Evelyn to another doctor. I was going to find someone who could reach the part of her that medicine hadn't been able to reach. I called a private cook named Clara Bennett, a woman who had been recommended by someone I trusted. I told her about Evelyn and asked whether she would come to our home. She agreed. I didn't tell Victoria until the morning Clara was supposed to arrive. Her expression remained pleasant when I mentioned it. "Of course, Dad. Whatever helps Mom." But later that evening, while passing Victoria's office, I heard her speaking through the partly closed door. Her voice was low. "Just get her to sign the power of attorney. Once that's done, everything becomes much easier." I stopped walking, and suddenly the woman I thought was helping my wife looked very different to me. I stood outside Victoria's office for several seconds, barely breathing. The words I had heard kept repeating inside my head. Get her to sign the power of attorney. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Maybe Victoria was talking about something unrelated to Evelyn. Maybe I had heard only part of the conversation. Maybe I was allowing grief, exhaustion, and fear to turn an innocent sentence into something sinister. But I knew my daughter, and I knew the difference between a casual conversation and a conversation someone didn't want me to hear. I walked away before Victoria could notice me standing there. I went downstairs and sat in the study, staring at the papers on my desk without reading a single word. Evelyn owned 30% of Hayes Construction Group. That wasn't a small investment. The company had grown enormously over the years, and her share was worth tens of millions of dollars. If Evelyn gave Victoria legal authority over her financial affairs, Victoria could potentially control decisions involving that stake. Suddenly, the constant attention Victoria had been giving her mother didn't look quite as innocent as it had the week before. The medications, the phone calls, the visitors Victoria supposedly kept away, the appointments, the constant reminders that Evelyn needed rest. I remembered Peggy Caldwell. I remembered Evelyn saying Peggy hadn't called. And I remembered Victoria telling me she had been protecting Mom from unnecessary stress. For the first time, I wondered how many calls Evelyn had actually received. I didn't confront Victoria. Clara's warning came back to me, watch first, so I watched. That afternoon, Victoria came into the study carrying a cup of coffee. You look exhausted, Dad. I'm fine. She smiled. Mom's finally sleeping better. That's good, right? Yes, she hesitated. I was thinking we should talk about her finances soon. My stomach tightened. What about them? Nothing urgent, I just think we need to make sure everything is organized in case her condition gets worse. My wife isn't dying, Victoria. I didn't say she was. She gave me a hurt expression. I only want to make sure we're prepared. Then she left. I sat there for another 20 minutes. At exactly 5 that evening, I heard the front door, 2 knocks, a pause, then another knock. I walked into the hallway and opened it. A woman stood on the porch carrying a plain canvas bag. She looked to be in her early 40s. Her dark hair was tied back and she wore a simple gray jacket over a white shirt. There was nothing flashy about her, but there was something unusually calm about the way she looked at me. Mr. Hayes. Yes, I'm Clara Bennett. I stepped aside. Come in. She entered, but instead of looking around at the expensive furniture or photographs covering the walls, she seemed to notice the atmosphere of the house itself. Then she looked directly at me. Before we discuss meals, could I meet your wife? That question surprised me. Of course. We had barely reached the stairs when Victoria appeared. Her smile came instantly. Clara. We're so glad you're here. Clara shook her hand. I'm glad to help. Mom has been having a difficult time, Victoria explained. We've tried practically everything. Clara simply nodded. I led her upstairs. Evelyn was sitting beside the window with an unopened book in her lap. When she saw Clara, her expression didn't change. Clara pulled a small stool beside her chair and sat down rather than standing over her. Then she asked something none of the doctors had thought to ask. Mrs. Hayes, when was the last time you ate something because you genuinely wanted it? Evelyn looked down at her hands. For several seconds she said nothing. Then her voice came out barely above a whisper. I don't remember. Clara didn't rush to reassure her. She simply waited. Finally, Evelyn looked toward the window. My grandmother used to make pot roast every Sunday. For the first time in months, something changed in her face. And downstairs, while Clara prepared that old family recipe, Victoria was standing in the hallway watching them from a distance. Her expression was no longer warm. It was worried. And I was about to discover exactly why. I stood up so quickly that the chair scraped against the kitchen floor. What exactly did she tell you? Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked at me with the same calm expression she had carried since walking into our house. Not everything, she said. And I don't think she was ready to. Clara, this is my wife we're talking about. I know. Then tell me. She folded the dish towel and placed it beside the sink. She said she's been trying to tell you something for a long time, but every time she tried, someone interrupted. My chest tightened. Victoria, Clara didn't say the name. She didn't need to. I thought about the past 3 months. Every time I'd tried to have a private conversation with Evelyn, Victoria somehow appeared. If I asked Evelyn about her health, Victoria answered. If Peggy called, Victoria said Evelyn needed rest. If Evelyn wanted to go somewhere, Victoria insisted she was too tired. I had accepted all of it because I believed my daughter was protecting her mother. Now I wondered whether she had been protecting something else. What else did Evelyn say? Clara looked toward the staircase. She said she doesn't want you to fight with Victoria. Why? Because she's afraid you'll lose your daughter. That sentence hurt more than I expected. I sat back down. For 42 years, Evelyn had always been the person who kept our family together. She forgave arguments before they became wars. She remembered birthdays nobody else remembered. She could turn a terrible Sunday dinner into a joke by dessert. And now she was afraid that telling me the truth would destroy our family. Did she say anything about the documents? I asked. Clara's expression changed slightly. What documents? I stared at her. The power of attorney. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she said she knows about it, My stomach dropped. How? She didn't explain. Did Victoria ask her to sign? I don't know. I wanted to go upstairs immediately. I wanted to wake Evelyn and demand the truth, but Clara reached across the table and stopped me. Don't. I looked at her hand. Why not? Because if Evelyn has spent months being afraid to speak, forcing her now could make her shut down again. I hated hearing that. But I knew Clara was right, so instead I asked, what do I do? Watch. That word again. Watch what? Who controls the information in this house? Who speaks for Evelyn? Who decides who she sees? Who handles her mail? Who answers her phone? Who knows about her appointments before she does? I felt a coldness settle over me. Victoria. Maybe, Clara said, but don't decide that yet. The next morning I began paying attention. At breakfast, Evelyn asked for coffee. Before I could stand, Victoria said, Mom shouldn't have caffeine. Evelyn lowered her eyes. I said nothing. Later, Peggy called. The phone rang 3 times before Victoria answered it. She's sleeping, she told her. I was standing 10 feet away. Evelyn was awake upstairs. I watched Victoria hang up. Then I asked casually, who was that? Peggy. Why didn't you give the phone to Mom? She needs rest, Dad. I nodded. But inside, something broke. That afternoon, I went into the study and opened the filing cabinet where we kept our financial records. The power of attorney folder was missing. I searched twice. Nothing. Then I remembered something. Victoria had started using the small office at the end of the hallway. I walked toward it. The door was locked. That had never happened before. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Victoria was standing at the other end of the hallway. She smiled. Looking for something, Dad? I couldn't answer, because in her hand was a folder, and on the front of it in bold black letters were the words, Evelyn Hayes, Power of Attorney. I didn't answer immediately. Evelyn was sitting against the pillows, both hands wrapped around the cup of ginger tea Clara had made for her. There was color in her face that I hadn't seen in months. She looked tired, but she looked present. More importantly, she looked like my wife again. What is it? She asked once more. I forced a small smile. Nothing. I was just thinking about how much better you look this morning. She studied me. You've never been good at hiding things from me. For 42 years, that sentence would have made me laugh. That morning, it frightened me. I sat beside her and took her hand. Are you happy Clara is here? Evelyn nodded. She listens. The simplicity of those 2 words hit me harder than anything else. Do you feel like people haven't been listening to you? She looked toward the window. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she whispered, sometimes. I waited. Who? She shook her head. I don't want to talk about it. I wanted to push her. I wanted to ask whether Victoria had pressured her about the power of attorney. I wanted to know what had happened to Peggy's calls. I wanted to know why my wife had been reduced to someone who barely spoke in her own home. But I remembered Clara's warning. Watch, so I squeezed Evelyn's hand. Whenever you're ready. She looked back at me. You still trust me? My throat tightened. More than anyone. Her eyes filled with tears. Then don't ask me questions yet. I nodded. Okay. I left the bedroom a few minutes later. Downstairs, Clara was preparing breakfast. She glanced at me once and immediately understood that something had happened. She talked to you, she said. Not much. But enough. I nodded. Clara placed a plate on the counter. Don't force her. I'm trying not to. Good. Then she lowered her voice. Something else happened yesterday. I looked at her. What? When I was cleaning up after dinner, Victoria came into the kitchen. What did she want? She asked me exactly what I had talked about with Evelyn. My stomach tightened. What did you tell her? That we talked about food. Did she believe you? Clara gave me a faint smile. I don't know. That wasn't the answer I wanted. Before I could say anything else, footsteps sounded behind us. Victoria entered the kitchen. She looked perfectly composed, dressed for the gym, her hair pulled back. Morning. Morning, I said. She looked at the breakfast Clara had prepared. What's that? Eggs and toast, Clara answered. For Mom? Yes. Victoria frowned. She shouldn't be eating that much. I turned toward her. She ate most of it yesterday. I know. The words came out too quickly. I stared at her. You know, Victoria froze for half a second, then she smiled. Mom told me. I hadn't told Victoria. Evelyn hadn't told her. Clara hadn't told her. So how did she know? I said nothing. Victoria poured herself some coffee. Actually, Dad, I wanted to talk to you. About what? Mom's finances. There it was again. The same subject. She placed her coffee on the counter. Her condition is improving, but we need to be realistic. If she gets worse again, someone needs legal authority to handle her affairs. I can handle them. Of course you can. Her voice was gentle. But what happens if something happens to you? I stared at her. Why would something happen to me? That's not what I meant. She stepped closer. I'm just saying we need a backup plan. I remembered the folder, the one she had been holding the night before. Where is the power of attorney paperwork? Her face changed, only for a moment, but I saw it. Why are you asking? Because you brought it up. I was trying to help. Then show it to me. Victoria looked directly into my eyes. I don't have it. I knew she was lying. I just didn't know why. Then Clara walked into the room carrying Evelyn's breakfast. She stopped when she saw us. Victoria smiled again, but this time the smile didn't reach her eyes. Actually, she said quietly, maybe we should all sit down and discuss what Mom really wants. And before I could respond, Evelyn appeared at the kitchen doorway. She had heard everything. She looked at Victoria, then at me, and finally at Clara. Her voice was barely audible. I know where she put the papers. To be continued. For the first time in months, I could see something returning to Evelyn that I thought we had lost. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden transformation. She didn't wake up one morning completely healed. It happened in small pieces. She started coming downstairs again. At first, only for breakfast. Then she began staying at the table after eating instead of immediately returning to her bedroom. She started asking Clara questions about the meals, about herbs, about where she bought certain ingredients. One morning, she even complained that the coffee was too strong. I almost laughed when I heard her. It was the most ordinary complaint in the world, and it felt like a miracle. Over the next couple of weeks, Evelyn slowly began becoming herself again. There were still difficult days. Some mornings she stayed upstairs, and some afternoons she sat quietly beside the window for hours. But overall, she was moving forward. One afternoon, I looked outside and saw her standing in the garden. She had put on her old coat and gardening gloves and was examining the rose bushes along the fence. Those roses had been her pride for years. I stood at the kitchen window watching her, afraid that if I moved, the moment would disappear. Clara came beside me. She's been out there 3 days this week, she said. I nodded. I know. I didn't tell her that seeing Evelyn in that garden had nearly brought me to tears. Then, on a Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I was upstairs in my study when I heard it. Before I could reach the stairs, Victoria had already opened the front door. A woman's voice floated through the hallway. It was Peggy Caldwell. Evelyn had known Peggy for more than 30 years. They had traveled together, celebrated birthdays together, and spent countless afternoons talking over coffee. But Victoria didn't invite her inside. I stopped halfway down the stairs and listened. She's still resting, Victoria said. Peggy's voice sounded confused. I've been trying to reach her for months. I know, Victoria replied. She's had a difficult time. The doctors don't want her overwhelmed with visitors. There was a pause. Then Peggy said something that made my hands tighten around the banister. 6 months, Victoria. She hasn't returned a single call, Victoria answered calmly. I understand how upsetting that must be, but Evelyn is embarrassed about her condition. She doesn't want people seeing her like this. I knew that wasn't true, because Evelyn had never once told me she didn't want Peggy around. The door closed. I continued down the stairs. Victoria turned and saw me. Her expression didn't change. That was Peggy, she said. I heard. She wanted to see Mom. Why didn't you let her? Victoria gave me the same gentle smile she had been using for weeks. Mom isn't ready. I stared at her. Did Evelyn tell you that? For the first time, Victoria hesitated. Then she said, I know my mother. She walked toward the kitchen. I remained on the stairs watching her disappear. Something had changed inside me. Until that moment, I had been suspicious. Now I was certain something was wrong. The following morning, Clara found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the rosemary plant on the kitchen windowsill. She brought it to me without saying a word. I unfolded it. The handwriting belonged to Peggy. She wrote that she had called Evelyn dozens of times over the previous 6 months. She had visited the house more than once and had never been allowed inside. She didn't believe Evelyn knew she had been trying to reach her. Then came the sentence that made my stomach drop. I don't think she knows I've been trying to see her. At the bottom was Peggy's phone number. I read the note twice. Then a third time. She needs to know, I said. Clara shook her head. Not yet. I looked at her. How can you say that? Because if Victoria is controlling who gets information, we need to understand how much she controls before we confront her. I hated the idea of waiting, but Clara was right, so I put Peggy's note inside my desk drawer. I didn't call her. Not yet. That evening, Clara met Peggy privately. When she returned, her face was serious. Richard, she said, sitting across from me, Peggy has been trying to reach Evelyn since June. I swallowed. How many times? 43. I stared at her. 43 times, Clara nodded. She kept count because she started wondering whether she was imagining things. Then Clara told me something even worse. Peggy had seen Evelyn through the window once. Evelyn had looked directly at her. Then she had looked away. Peggy believed her oldest friend had deliberately rejected her. But now I knew the truth. Evelyn might never have known Peggy was there. And suddenly, I had to ask myself the question I'd been avoiding since this nightmare began. If Victoria could keep Peggy away from Evelyn for 6 months, who else had she kept away? The question kept circling through my mind long after Clara had finished telling me about Peggy. Who else had Victoria kept away from Evelyn? I didn't have an answer, but I was beginning to realize that I had spent months accepting explanations because they were easier than asking uncomfortable questions. That night, I barely slept. The following morning, Clara found me in the kitchen before sunrise. She was holding something in her hands. Richard, she said quietly, I found this. She placed a folded piece of paper on the table. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Evelyn. My hands began to shake. Where did you find it? In the pocket of an old coat in the back hallway. I unfolded the paper. At the top, Evelyn had written a few words. Things I need to say if I get the chance. My eyes moved slowly down the page. She had written about me first. She wanted me to know that marrying me had been the best decision of her life. Then she had written about Daniel. She said she wasn't angry with him, even though she believed he had made choices he would eventually regret. Then came Peggy. I don't understand why Peggy stopped calling. I miss her every day. I had to stop reading. My vision blurred. Peggy hadn't stopped calling. She had called 43 times. Evelyn simply hadn't known. At the very bottom of the page was a newer sentence written in darker ink. To the woman who sat down and listened to me, thank you. I stared at those words. Clara had only been in our home for a few weeks, yet Evelyn had already found enough trust in her to leave that message behind. She knew, I whispered. Clara sat across from me. She knew something was wrong. All this time, I looked toward the ceiling. My wife was upstairs writing letters because she didn't know whether she'd ever get the chance to tell anyone the truth. Clara didn't try to comfort me with empty words. She simply placed her hand over mine. After a long silence, I folded the letter carefully. What do? We keep watching. I nodded. We agreed not to tell Evelyn that we'd found the letter. I thought that would be the hardest thing I had to do. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, Victoria came into my study carrying a thick manila folder. She closed the door behind her. Dad, I need to show you something. She placed the folder on my desk. What is it? Please read it before you react. I opened it. The first page contained a photograph of Clara. The next pages were filled with information about her professional history. Then I saw several legal records. According to the documents, Clara had previously worked for elderly clients who later became involved in disputes over wills, estates, and financial arrangements. I looked up. "Where did you get this?" Victoria sat across from me. "I have a friend who works in background screening." She paused. "When you hired Clara without going through an agency, I became worried." I turned another page. There were court references, dates, names, and descriptions of previous cases. Everything looked professional. Everything looked real. Victoria leaned forward. "I'm not saying Clara hasn't helped Mom." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying she knows how to make vulnerable people trust her." I closed the folder. "You're accusing her of manipulating your mother." "I'm asking you to be careful." Her voice sounded sincere, almost frightened. And that was what made the situation so difficult, because the documents looked convincing. But I couldn't forget the timing. Clara had been in our house for only a few weeks, and during those weeks, Evelyn had begun eating again. She was speaking again. She was gardening again. She was becoming the woman I remembered. I thought about the power of attorney. I thought about Peggy's 43 unanswered calls. And then I remembered something else. A phone conversation I had overheard weeks earlier. Victoria had mentioned a name: Marcus. Marcus Webb had worked for me for more than a decade. He had access to company records, employee information, and financial systems. If someone wanted to create a report using genuine records but arrange them to tell a false story, Marcus would have access to the kind of information they needed. I looked down at Victoria's folder. Suddenly, I wasn't sure whether it was evidence against Clara or evidence against the person who had handed it to me. I closed the folder. "I'll look into this." Victoria stood. "That's all I wanted." She left. I waited until the door closed. Then I picked up the phone. There was only one person I wanted to speak to. "Clara." She appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. Her eyes went immediately to the folder. "What happened?" I pushed it across the desk. "Victoria just gave me this." Clara opened it. She read the first page, then the second. Her face remained calm, but when she reached the final page, she looked up at me. "Richard." "What?" She pointed to one of the case numbers. "This isn't what you think it is." My heart began pounding. "Why?" "Because I recognize this case." She looked at me. "And if I'm right, someone has taken a real case and changed the story." Clara turned the folder toward herself again and tapped one of the case numbers with her finger. "I know this case," she repeated. "And the way Victoria presented it isn't accurate." I leaned forward. "Tell me what really happened." Clara took a breath. "I worked for an elderly woman in Westchester several years ago. Her son hired me because his mother had difficulty eating after a medical problem. He wanted her on a restricted diet because he was terrified she might choke." "What did you do?" I disagreed with him. His mother was still capable of eating normally, and I believed taking away solid food would make her weaker. She paused. "Her son became angry. He accused me of interfering with the family's decisions." "Was there a legal dispute?" "Yes, but it wasn't about money." I looked back at the document. "Then why does this report make it sound like you were involved in an inheritance dispute?" "Because someone took a real disagreement and changed the conclusion." Her voice remained calm. That frightened me more than if she had become defensive. "Clara, understand something. I can't simply ignore what Victoria showed me. I know. And if you're telling me the truth, I need proof." "I understand that too." She looked toward the folder. "But before you decide whether to believe me, ask yourself one question." "What question?" "Who benefits if I leave this house?" I didn't answer, because I already knew the answer that terrified me. "Victoria." If Clara stayed, Evelyn continued improving. If Clara left, Evelyn might return to the condition she had been in before. And if Evelyn became weak enough again, Victoria could argue that her mother needed someone to manage her affairs. The power of attorney, the missing phone calls, the strange behavior, everything seemed connected. but I still couldn't prove it. That afternoon, I sat alone in my study for nearly an hour. I looked at the folder. Then I looked at the financial documents on my desk. Then I thought about Evelyn. I was 65 years old. My wife had been beside me for almost 4 decades. If I made the wrong decision now, I might never forgive myself. I called Clara back into the study. She sat across from me. "I need you to understand something," I said. "If I keep you here and this report turns out to be legitimate, I'm putting Evelyn at risk." Clara nodded. "And if I send you away because of a false report, I'm also putting Evelyn at risk." She didn't argue. That was what made the decision harder. "I don't know who to believe," I admitted. Clara looked directly at me. "Yes, you do." I stared at her. "What does that mean?" "You've been watching Evelyn for months. You know what happened after I arrived." I lowered my eyes. She was right. For the first time in months, Evelyn had started eating. She was sleeping better. She had returned to her garden. She had begun speaking again. Those things weren't theories. I had watched them happen. Still, fear won. "I want you to leave for a few days." Clara was silent. "I'm not firing you," I added quickly. "I need Victoria to believe that I've accepted what she showed me." Clara understood immediately. "You want her to think she won." "Exactly." She stood. "All right." She didn't argue. She simply gathered her things. At the doorway, she stopped. "Mr. Hayes." I looked up. "The person you should be most careful of isn't the person standing in front of you." My stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" She held my gaze. "I think somewhere inside you already know." Then she walked away. I remained in the study, staring at the closed door. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open, then close. The house became strangely quiet. I went downstairs. Evelyn was standing in the kitchen doorway. She looked around. "Where's Clara?" I had prepared an explanation. But when I saw the concern in Evelyn's eyes, I couldn't bring myself to lie convincingly. "She had to leave for a few days." Evelyn stared at me. "Why?" "It's complicated." She lowered her eyes. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She was helping me remember who I was. I couldn't answer. Evelyn walked back toward the stairs. Then she stopped. Without turning around, she whispered, "Richard, you made a mistake." And I suddenly realized that Evelyn knew far more about what was happening in our house than I had ever imagined. The next morning, Evelyn didn't come downstairs. I waited until 8, then 8:30. At 9, I went upstairs and knocked on her door. "Evie." There was a long silence. Finally, she answered. "I'm tired, Richard." Those 4 words frightened me more than they should have. 4 days earlier, she had been sitting at the kitchen table eating Clara's breakfast. She had complained about the coffee, asked about the recipe, and even laughed when Clara told her that I had once burned an entire Thanksgiving turkey. Now she wouldn't leave her room. I opened the door slightly. Evelyn was sitting in her armchair beside the window. Her breakfast tray was untouched. I looked at it. Toast, eggs, orange juice, everything cold. "You should eat something." "I'm not hungry." I wanted to tell her that Clara was coming back, but she wasn't, and I had made that decision. I had convinced myself I was protecting Evelyn. Instead, I was watching the progress she had made disappear in front of me. Victoria entered the room a few minutes later. "Mom needs a structured routine," she said. I looked at her. "She needs food." "Of course." "We had someone here who was getting her to eat." Victoria's expression tightened. "Clara was a cook, Dad. She wasn't a medical professional. She helped. Temporarily." That word bothered me. Temporarily. As though Evelyn's improvement had been an inconvenience that needed to end. Victoria told me she had arranged for a nutrition specialist to visit every other day. The woman arrived that afternoon with measured containers, charts, and a clipboard. She was polite, professional, efficient, but she never once sat beside Evelyn. She measured portions, recorded calories, checked boxes, then left. Watching her carry the untouched tray upstairs made me feel helpless. At breakfast the following morning, Victoria spoke confidently about the new routine. "Dr. Hartley thinks Mom responds better to consistency." She was doing better before. Victoria looked at me. She had a few good days. I said nothing. That doesn't mean the underlying problem disappeared. I stared into my coffee. I wanted to argue, but I didn't have evidence. Only instincts. And instincts weren't enough. That evening, I went into my study. I had work waiting for me, so I opened the company system to review some documents before going to bed. Hayes Construction kept extensive digital records. Employee files, contracts, financial documents, legal information. Everything was protected behind different levels of access. Every time someone opened a restricted file, the system recorded it. I usually never looked at those logs. That night, something made me check. I scrolled through the recent activity. Then I stopped. One employee's name appeared repeatedly. Marcus Webb. Marcus had worked for me for 12 years. He was one of the people I trusted most with sensitive company information. But the timestamp made no sense. 11:42 p.m. I checked the files he had accessed, personnel records, employment histories, archived HR documents, and then I noticed something else. The system showed that information had been exported to an external device. My heart began beating faster. I kept scrolling. 2 days later, Marcus had accessed another group of files, civil litigation records, cross-referenced with personnel information. Again, the data had been exported. I leaned back in my chair. The folder Victoria had given me about Clara contained exactly the kind of information that could have been assembled from those records. Suddenly, the report didn't look like evidence against Clara. It looked like evidence of how someone had tried to discredit her. I checked the dates again. The access had happened weeks before Victoria showed me the folder. My hands went cold. Someone had been preparing a case against Clara before I had even suspected her, and whoever had done it had access to my company's private systems. I immediately called my attorney, Frank Doyle. He answered after a few rings. "Richard, I need you to look at something tonight." I sent him the access information. There was silence on the phone. Then he said, "Don't confront anyone yet." "Why?" "Because if these records are authentic, you may have just found something much bigger than a family dispute." I looked toward the hallway. Upstairs, my wife was alone. Her untouched dinner sat outside her bedroom. Frank continued, "Get me the complete access history tomorrow. And Richard, don't let anyone know what you found." I agreed. After we ended the call, I sat in the darkness of my study. Then my phone buzzed. A message had arrived from Peggy. Only 4 words. Asterisk, asterisk, please, she needs you. Asterisk, asterisk, I stared at the screen. For the first time, I understood that whatever was happening inside my house wasn't simply about Evelyn's health. Someone had been planning something, and I was beginning to discover how far back the plan went. I didn't sleep that night. After Frank told me to come in first thing the next morning, I drove home through empty streets with the contract sitting on the passenger seat beside me. The house was dark when I arrived. I stood in the driveway for a moment, looking at the upstairs window. Evelyn was awake. I knew because I could see the faint light behind the curtains. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely helpless. She had found something, something important, and now I needed to understand exactly what it meant. The following afternoon, Frank gave me the full contract. It was more than 200 pages. Victoria had been calling it a major opportunity for Hayes Construction, a new materials supplier that could supposedly reduce our costs and expand our operations. I carried the binder upstairs to Evelyn. She was sitting beside the window with a cup of tea that had already gone cold. "How are you feeling?" "Tired." She said it plainly, without pretending. I sat beside her. "Frank is reviewing the contract." "Which contract?" "The materials import agreement. The one Victoria wants you to sign." I looked at her. "You know about it." "I'm not deaf, Richard." For the first time in months, I almost laughed. That dry little edge in her voice sounded like the Evelyn I remembered. I placed the binder on the table. "I'll leave it here." She looked at the enormous stack of pages. "I'm not planning to read 200 pages. Then she smiled faintly. "But leave it anyway. I'd rather look at something besides that window. I went downstairs. 20 minutes later, I heard her call my name, not softly, urgently. I ran upstairs. Evelyn was standing beside the table. She had opened the binder. Her finger was resting on a specific section. "Page 47, she said. I stepped closer. "What did you find?" She pointed toward a paragraph buried in the contract. I read it once, then again. My stomach dropped. The clause stated that if anything went wrong with the shipment, customs violations, regulatory problems, fraud allegations, or any other legal dispute, Hayes Construction would assume responsibility. The overseas supplier would be protected. Our company would take the risk. I looked at Evelyn. "This can't be right." "It is." Victoria said this was a standard agreement. "Then Victoria doesn't understand contracts." I stared at the page. Evelyn's hand was trembling, not from weakness, from anger. "I spent 38 years watching you read contracts," she said. "I know what dangerous language looks like." I swallowed. "Who showed you this?" "Nobody." "Then how did you find it?" "I looked." She tapped the page. Even when everyone thought I had stopped paying attention, I was still paying attention. I felt something shift inside me. For months I had thought Evelyn was disappearing. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe she had simply been trapped inside her own silence. "This company is trying to make us responsible for something," she said. "Who?" "I don't know." Then she looked directly at me. "But whatever is inside those shipments, they don't want their name attached to it." I immediately thought about Victoria, the power of attorney, the strange financial conversations, Marcus accessing company records, Clara being removed from the house. All of it was starting to connect. "I need to call Frank." "Tonight." I reached the doorway. "Richard," I turned. "Bring me real food when you come back." I smiled. "What do you want?" She looked toward the kitchen. "Surprise me." It was such a simple request, but I almost cried. I went downstairs and called Frank. He answered immediately. "Frank?" "Yes." "Page 47. There was silence. "She found it." "Evelyn." Another pause. Then Frank's voice became much more serious. "We need to talk." "I know." "Not only about the contract." I sat down. "Tell me everything." Frank asked me to meet him at the office. When I arrived, several documents were already spread across the conference table. He closed the door. "The company Victoria wants Hayes Construction to do business with was incorporated in Delaware only 8 months ago." I stared at him. 8 months. April 14th. "Victoria started pushing the deal 6 months later." Frank nodded. "And there's no physical office, no real business history, no established trade references." He slid another document toward me. "The supplier is basically a shell company." My hands became cold. "What about the shipment?" "That's worse." He showed me several signatures from the shipping documents. "At least 2 appear questionable. I've sent them to a document examiner." Then he showed me the payment structure. "The contract requires Hayes Construction to send a $2 million deposit through multiple international accounts before the shipment is released." I looked up. "Where does the money ultimately go?" "We don't know yet." Frank leaned back. "But the structure is designed to make the final destination difficult to identify." I stared at the contract. Suddenly, I understood why Victoria had been so desperate for me to sign. This wasn't simply a bad business deal. Someone had built a trap around my company, and the person who had been pushing me toward it was my own daughter. Frank looked at me. "Richard, I think we need to find out exactly what Victoria has been planning." I nodded. But neither of us noticed that the conference room door had not been completely closed. And outside, someone had been standing there long enough to hear every word. I closed Daniel's bedroom door behind me and stood in the hallway for several seconds. My son had finally told me the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Victoria had known about his financial mistakes. She had used those mistakes to keep him silent, threatening to expose everything if he went against her. Daniel hadn't planned any of this. He had simply been too afraid to stop it. For years, I had imagined that when my children grew up, I would be able to protect them from the mistakes I had made. I had never imagined I would have to protect them from each other. I went downstairs and found Evelyn's hallway lamp still glowing. That small light had been there since Daniel was a child. Evelyn always left it on at night so he could find his way if he woke up. Now, decades later, Daniel was sleeping only a few doors away from her, and neither of them knew how much the other had been carrying. My phone rang at 7 the next morning. "Frank, I found the filing." I immediately stepped into the study and closed the door. "What filing?" "The conservatorship petition." I gripped the edge of the desk. "Victoria actually prepared one." "Not Victoria directly. A law firm in California prepared it on her behalf." My stomach tightened. The documents were apparently ready to be submitted to probate court. The petition claimed Evelyn was no longer capable of managing her financial affairs and needed someone appointed to make decisions for her. And that someone, according to the documents, was Victoria. Frank explained that a conservatorship could give Victoria control over Evelyn's finances and major decisions. That included Evelyn's 30% ownership of Hayes Construction Group. I felt cold all over. "Has it been filed?" "No," I exhaled. "Then we still have time." "Yes, but not much." There was a pause. "Richard, there's something else." I waited. "The physician who signed the medical declaration is Dr. Philip Mercer." The name hit me immediately. I knew him. He was one of the doctors I had taken Evelyn to see months earlier. He had examined her for less than an hour and told me he couldn't find a medical explanation for her condition. At the time, I had been grateful. I thought he was simply another doctor who couldn't solve the mystery. Now I realized he might have been part of it. "You're sure?" "I'm certain." I sat down. "When did the petition preparation begin?" "Late September." That was before I had even taken Evelyn to see Mercer, which meant Victoria may have contacted him before that appointment. The realization made my hands tremble. She hadn't been waiting to see whether Evelyn recovered. She had already been preparing for a future in which Evelyn would be declared incapable. Frank continued, "The good news is that nothing has been submitted yet. What do? We build our own case." I listened carefully. He wanted to document everything: the suspicious transfers, the shell company, the manufactured report about Clara, Marcus's computer activity, and the connection to Dr. Mercer. Then we would take the evidence to federal investigators. "But Victoria can't know we know any of this," Frank said. I looked toward the study door. "Why?" "Because right now she believes she's winning." That sentence stayed with me. Victoria thought Clara was gone. She thought Evelyn was weak. She thought Daniel was afraid. And she thought I was still the same trusting father who accepted every explanation she gave me. Frank wanted me to let her believe all of that for a little longer. I hated the idea, but I understood it. "Don't file anything yet," I told him. "I won't." After the call ended, I stood alone in my study. Then I made another decision. I called Clara. She answered after the third ring. "Mr. Hayes." "Clara, I owe you an apology." There was silence. "I should never have believed that report without investigating it properly. You were trying to protect your wife." "I know, but I still made the wrong choice." Another pause. "Why are you calling?" I looked through the window at the frozen garden. "Because I need you to come back." "To cook?" "No," I swallowed. "I think something is about to happen in this house, and I need someone here who has seen what happened from the beginning." Clara was quiet for several seconds. "Do you trust me now?" I thought about Evelyn's empty plate, her return to the garden, her warning, the fake report, the evidence against Victoria. "Yes." "Then I'll come back." I ended the call. For the next several days I played the part Frank had asked me to play. I acted normal around Victoria. I didn't mention the shell company. I didn't mention the conservatorship. I didn't mention Marcus. And I certainly didn't tell her that Clara was returning. Then Victoria announced that she wanted to have a family dinner. "Thursday evening," she said. "Just the four of us." I smiled. "Sounds good." She had no idea that Thursday night would be different from every other dinner we'd ever had. Because while Victoria believed she was preparing a celebration, I was preparing something else. A trap. And I knew exactly who needed to be sitting at that table when the truth finally came out. Monday morning arrived faster than I wanted. I woke before sunrise and lay in bed listening to the house. Everything sounded normal. The heating system clicked on. A car passed somewhere beyond the driveway. A bird called from the bare trees outside the window. But nothing about that morning felt normal to me. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what was coming. And I knew Victoria had no idea. I got dressed quietly and went downstairs. Evelyn was already awake. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Clara drinking coffee. I stopped in the doorway. 3 weeks earlier, I couldn't have imagined seeing my wife sitting there like that. Her shoulders were straighter. Her eyes were clear, and she was eating. Not much, but enough. Clara looked at me. "Ready," I nodded. Evelyn reached for my hand. "Come home tonight," she said. "I will." She held my hand for another second. "Whatever happens today, don't let them convince you that you imagined everything." I looked at her. "I won't." She smiled. "Good." Then I left. The meeting was being held in a conference room on the 22nd floor of my company's Manhattan office. Frank had arranged for 2 independent financial specialists to attend. They had spent the previous days examining the records we had collected. I didn't know exactly what they had found. Frank had deliberately kept some details from me. He said there were things I didn't need to know until Victoria was sitting across the table. At 9 o'clock, I walked into the conference room. Frank was already there. 2 men sat at the far end of the table. He introduced them as Robert Haynes, a forensic accountant, and Carol Briggs, an independent auditor who specialized in financial investigations. They were quiet, professional, the kind of people who didn't need to raise their voices because documents did the talking for them. Daniel arrived a few minutes later. He looked exhausted. I had spoken with him the night before. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I had asked. He nodded. "I should have stopped her earlier." "Then today is your chance." He didn't answer. At 9:12, the elevator doors opened. Victoria walked into the room. She looked completely confident, charcoal blazer, leather portfolio, hair pulled back neatly. The same calm expression she had worn every time she believed she was in control. She smiled when she saw me. "Good morning, Dad." "Good morning." Her eyes moved around the table. Then she noticed Robert and Carol. For less than a second, her expression changed. She recovered quickly. "Are they joining us for the signing?" I looked at Frank, then back at Victoria. "Sit down." She hesitated, then took the chair opposite me. Daniel sat beside her. Victoria opened her portfolio. "I assume we're finally ready to complete the agreement." I folded my hands on the table. "I'm not signing it." Her smile remained, but it became thinner, still concerned about the language. "No." I slid the first document across the table. "The company registration." Victoria looked down. "Coastal Pacific Materials. Registered 8 months ago." So, I pushed another document toward her. "The registered agent." Then another. "The payment from your personal account." Her eyes stopped moving. "You transferred $40,000 to the company before you ever told me about the deal." She looked at me. "That was an investment." "An investment in a company you wanted Hayes Construction to pay $2 million to." She opened her mouth. I continued before she could answer. "Then there's Marcus." Her face changed, just slightly, but enough. I placed the computer access logs on the table. "These records show that someone used our internal system to gather information about Clara." Victoria stared at the pages. "Why would I do that?" "I don't know." I paused. "But I know when the files were accessed." Frank placed another document in front of her. "And we know where the fabricated report originated." Victoria's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Daniel looked at her. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Then Frank placed the final folder on the table. Victoria looked at it. "What is that?" "The conservatorship petition." Her face went completely still. I watched her carefully. The room became silent. You prepared a petition claiming your mother was incapable of managing her own affairs. Victoria finally spoke. That's not what it is. Then tell us what it is. She couldn't, not immediately. Her breathing had changed, and I knew we had finally reached the truth. Then the conference room door opened. Everyone turned. Evelyn was standing there. She wasn't using a walker. She wasn't holding onto the wall. She simply stood in the doorway, completely upright. Victoria stared at her mother. Evelyn walked slowly into the room. Then she pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. She placed her hand over mine and looked directly at Victoria. Her voice was quiet, but every person in that room heard it. Victoria, I was never as helpless as you wanted everyone to believe. Victoria stared at her mother as though she had just seen a ghost. For several seconds, nobody in the conference room moved. Evelyn remained perfectly still beside me, one hand resting on the table and the other holding mine. She looked tired, but there was a strength in her eyes that I hadn't seen in months. Victoria finally found her voice. "Mom, you shouldn't be here." Evelyn looked at her. "Why?" "Because you're exhausted." I decided for myself that I wanted to come. Victoria looked toward me. "Dad, this is exactly what I've been worried about. She's not well enough to be making decisions like this." Evelyn's expression hardened. "You've been saying that for months." Victoria went silent. Frank leaned forward. "Mrs. Hayes, are you comfortable continuing?" Evelyn nodded. "I am." Frank looked toward Victoria. "Then let's continue." Victoria shifted in her chair. "You've all misunderstood what I was trying to do." I looked at her. "Then explain it." She took a breath. "The company needed protection." "From what?" "The economy, competition, potential losses." I pointed toward the contract. "By transferring all liability to Hayes Construction." "That wasn't the intention." "Then what was the intention?" She didn't answer. Robert, the forensic accountant, opened another folder. "We traced the payment instructions in the agreement." Victoria looked at him. "And the receiving accounts are connected to two companies." He placed a chart on the table. "One is Coastal Pacific Materials. The other is an investment company registered under a different name." I studied the chart. "What does that second company have to do with us?" Robert looked at Victoria. "That company has received payments from an account belonging to Daniel." Daniel's face went pale. Victoria turned toward him. "Daniel," he interrupted her. "Don't." It was the first time I had ever heard him speak to Victoria that way. He looked at me. "Your dad deserves the truth." Victoria shook her head. "Daniel, you don't understand." "I understand enough." He reached into his jacket and pulled out several folded documents. "I found these in Victoria's office last week." Victoria stood. "Where did you get those?" "Your desk." Her face went white. Daniel placed the papers on the table. "They're copies of my debts. Every loan, every credit card, every payment I missed." He looked at me. "She told me that if I ever went against her, she'd send everything to your attorney and make sure I lost Victoria." I stared at my daughter. "Is that true?" Victoria didn't answer. Daniel continued. "She told me the only way to save myself was to help her convince you to sign the contract." Victoria whispered his name, but Daniel kept going. "She said once the money moved, everything would be fixed." I felt a heaviness settle over me. "Where would the money go?" Daniel looked at Victoria. "I don't know." Robert answered for him. "We have a strong indication that a portion would have been transferred through several intermediary accounts before reaching an offshore investment entity." Carol placed another document beside the chart. "We also found unusual activity involving company records." I looked at her. "Marcus," she nodded. "Marcus accessed restricted files repeatedly." "But he wasn't acting alone." Victoria closed her eyes. I watched her carefully. "Who else?" She remained silent. Then Evelyn spoke. "Ask her about Dr. Mercer." Victoria opened her eyes. The room went still. I turned toward Evelyn. "You knew?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "He visited me twice after the first examination." I felt my stomach drop. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Victoria was always there." Evelyn looked toward our daughter. She told me you were too stressed after James died. She said I shouldn't burden you. Victoria shook her head. Mom, I was trying to protect you. No, Evelyn's voice remained quiet. You were trying to control me. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, she looked less like the woman who had been manipulating everyone and more like the little girl I remembered holding on my shoulders. Then she whispered something I never expected. I did it because I was scared. I leaned forward. Scared of what? She looked at me. Going broke. The room became silent. Victoria finally admitted that Daniel's financial problems were only part of it. She had accumulated debts of her own. She had borrowed money against investments and lost more than she could repay. The company deal was supposed to solve everything. The conservatorship would give her control over Evelyn's assets. And the power of attorney would make it easier to move money without raising immediate suspicion. I listened without interrupting. Then Victoria said the words that hurt most. I never planned to hurt Mom. Evelyn looked at her. But you did. Victoria began crying. I wanted to comfort her. She was my daughter, but I couldn't forget the months Evelyn had spent alone upstairs. I couldn't forget Peggy's unanswered calls. I couldn't forget Clara being falsely accused. And I couldn't forget how close I had come to signing away control of everything we had built. Frank gathered the documents. We're not finished. Victoria looked up. What do you mean? Frank's expression was cold. There are still questions about who helped you. Victoria froze. I knew immediately. There was another name, another person behind the plan. And when Victoria finally looked toward the door, I knew the next revelation was going to be worse than everything we had already heard. Victoria looked around the conference room as if she were searching for a way out. For the first time since this nightmare began, she no longer looked like the woman who had controlled every conversation in our house. She looked frightened. Frank remained standing near the table, the formal notice in his hand. The investigation has already been referred to federal authorities, he said. You will have an opportunity to explain your side. Victoria looked at me. Dad, please. I couldn't answer. There had been a time when hearing my daughter say those two words would have made me forget everything else. But I kept thinking about Evelyn sitting alone upstairs, the unanswered calls, the meals left untouched, the documents prepared behind our backs. The report created to make Clara look dangerous, and the plan to convince a court that my wife couldn't manage her own affairs. Victoria had crossed a line I couldn't simply pretend wasn't there. She stood and pushed her chair backward. I need some air. Frank stepped toward the door. The agent is waiting downstairs. Victoria stopped. Her face went pale. You called the FBI? Frank nodded. The evidence was submitted before this meeting. She looked at me again. You planned this. I shook my head. No, Victoria. I looked toward the folder on the table. You planned this. She stared at me for several seconds. Then she turned toward the door. Daniel remained seated. He didn't follow her. I watched him lower his head into his hands. He looked broken. I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing. He didn't look up. I should have stopped her sooner. You were afraid. I was still wrong. I didn't disagree. Sometimes fear explains what we do. It doesn't erase the damage. After Victoria left the room, the atmosphere changed completely. The people who had spent weeks gathering evidence began organizing the remaining documents. Marcus had agreed to cooperate with investigators. His statement explained how Victoria had asked him to search company records and collect information that could be used against Clara. He had also admitted that Victoria promised him a percentage of the money from the proposed transaction. The more I learned, the more I realized how carefully everything had been planned. The shell company, the financial transfers, the fabricated background report, the conservatorship paperwork, Dr. Mercer's questionable declaration. None of it had happened by accident, but there was still one person I needed to hear from, Evelyn. She had been sitting beside me through the entire meeting. Now she slowly stood. I immediately reached for her arm. She shook her head. I can walk. And she did. No walker, no chair, no one holding her. She crossed the room slowly but confidently. Every step seemed to say something she hadn't been able to say for months. When she reached the door, she stopped. "Richard," I looked at her. "I want to go home. We will. Not later." She looked directly into my eyes. "Now," I nodded. "Okay." We left the office together. As we walked toward the elevator, Evelyn leaned slightly toward me. "I'm tired. I know. But I'm not afraid anymore." I looked at her. "Neither am I." On the drive home, neither of us spoke for a long time. The city slowly disappeared behind us as we headed toward Connecticut. Eventually, Evelyn broke the silence. "I'm sorry." I tightened my hands around the steering wheel. "For what?" "For not telling you sooner." I shook my head. "I should be the one apologizing." She turned toward me. "I knew something was happening." "I know. I tried to tell you." "I know." Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought you would believe me." That sentence hurt. I reached across the center console and took her hand. "I should have." She squeezed my fingers. "We're even." I smiled despite myself. When we arrived home, Clara was waiting in the kitchen. The smell of something warm filled the house. Evelyn stopped in the hallway. She closed her eyes and breathed in. Then she smiled. For the first time in months, it wasn't a forced smile. It was real. Clara came toward her. "You made it." Evelyn nodded. "I did." Clara looked at me. I simply nodded back. No explanation was necessary. That evening, Peggy arrived. The moment she saw Evelyn standing in the hallway, she began crying. Evelyn walked toward her. They didn't say anything. They simply embraced. I turned away and gave them privacy. Later, the five of us sat around the dining table. Clara served dinner, Peggy told stories, Daniel laughed quietly, and Evelyn ate. Not because someone told her to, not because a nutrition chart demanded it. She ate because she wanted to. I watched her across the table and realized something I had failed to understand for months. My wife had never disappeared. She had been fighting to find her way back to us, and now she was finally home. For the first time in months, the house felt different, not perfect, not peaceful, but alive. Evelyn had barely stepped through the front door when she stopped in the hallway and closed her eyes. The smell of Clara's cooking drifted through the house. Something warm was simmering on the stove. Butter, herbs, roasted vegetables, and something else I couldn't identify. Evelyn breathed it in slowly. Then she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. Clara appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "I thought you might be hungry." Evelyn looked at her. "I am," Clara smiled. "Then sit down." Evelyn didn't argue. She walked into the kitchen and pulled out a chair. I stood in the doorway watching them. 3 weeks earlier, I had believed Clara was dangerous because Victoria had shown me a folder full of carefully arranged documents. Now I understood how easily fear could make a person believe the wrong story. My phone rang. It was Frank. I stepped into the study to answer. "Richard." "Yes." "Everything is moving." I sat down. "What does that mean?" "Marcus is cooperating fully." I closed my eyes. The last thing I wanted was for Marcus to become another person destroyed by Victoria's decisions. But Frank explained that Marcus had already provided investigators with the digital records showing what Victoria had asked him to do. The access dates, the files, the exported information, the instructions he had received. He had even turned over the device he used. "What about the money?" I asked. "They're tracing it." "And Dr. Mercer?" "The medical board has been notified." I leaned back in my chair. "So it's really happening?" "Yes." There was a pause. "But Richard, these things take time." "I know. The investigation isn't finished. Nothing has been decided in court." "I understand." "Good." Frank's voice softened. "You should focus on your wife now." I looked toward the kitchen. Through the doorway, I could see Evelyn laughing at something Clara had said. For months, I hadn't heard that sound. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." After we ended the call, I stayed in the study for a few minutes. I thought about everything that had happened, the doctors, the unanswered phone calls, the power of attorney, the fake report, the shell company. The conservatorship, my daughter, my son, my wife. It felt impossible that all of it had happened inside one family. But then I remembered something James had told me years earlier. The truth is always cheaper in the long run. I wished I had remembered those words sooner. At 6 o'clock, Peggy arrived. She carried a bottle of wine under one arm. The moment she stepped through the door and saw Evelyn, her eyes filled with tears. Neither of them spoke. Peggy crossed the hallway and wrapped both arms around my wife. Evelyn held her tightly. I turned away. Some moments belonged only to the people who had waited too long for them. Later, we all sat around the dining table. Clara served dinner. Peggy talked about the dozens of times she had tried to reach Evelyn. Evelyn listened with tears in her eyes. "I thought you had stopped calling me," she whispered. Peggy shook her head. "Never." Evelyn looked down. "I thought you didn't want to see me. I thought you didn't want to see me." They stared at each other. Then both of them started laughing through their tears. I watched them and realized how much damage one person's manipulation could cause without anyone realizing it. A missed phone call, a blocked visitor, a lie repeated often enough that eventually everyone believes it. Daniel arrived later that evening. He stood awkwardly near the doorway. Evelyn looked at him. "Come sit down." He did. For several minutes nobody spoke. Then Daniel looked at his mother. "I'm sorry." Evelyn reached across the table. "You were afraid." "I should have told Dad." "Yes." Daniel lowered his eyes. "But you're here now." He looked up. Evelyn smiled. "That's what matters." I realized then that forgiveness wasn't the same thing as forgetting. We would never forget what had happened, but perhaps we didn't have to spend the rest of our lives allowing it to control us. The next morning, Evelyn walked into the garden. The roses were nearly bare. Winter had taken most of the color away. She stood there for several minutes. Then she turned toward me. "I want to plant new ones in spring." I smiled. "How many?" She thought about it. "Enough to fill the whole fence." "That's a lot of roses." "I have a lot of time to make up for." I walked over and took her hand. She squeezed mine. For the first time in months I believed her when she said she had a future. Not because the investigation was over, not because Victoria's actions had been forgotten, but because Evelyn had finally stopped living in fear of what might happen next. She was looking forward, and so was I. Still, that evening when I opened the front door, I found an envelope lying on the floor. There was no return address, only my name written across the front. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 4 words. "This isn't over yet." I read the 4 words again. "This isn't over yet." For several seconds I simply stood in the hallway holding the envelope. Evelyn was upstairs. Clara was in the kitchen. The house was quiet. Everything should have felt safe. Victoria was no longer in control. The investigation had begun. Marcus was cooperating. Dr. Mercer was being questioned. The suspicious company had been exposed before I signed anything. So why did those 4 words make my hands shake? I carried the envelope into my study and placed it on the desk. There was no return address, no stamp. It had been left inside our locked front door. That meant whoever delivered it had been close enough to enter our property without being noticed. I called Frank. He answered immediately. "Richard, I received something." "What?" "A note." I read it to him. There was a long pause. "Don't touch the envelope again." "I already opened it." "That's fine. Put it in a plastic bag and don't throw anything away." I did exactly what he said. Then I told him about the missing return address. "Do you have security cameras?" "Outside." "Check them." I opened the security system on my computer. The cameras covered the driveway, front gate, and side entrance. I went back through the recordings from that afternoon. At first, nothing looked unusual. A delivery truck, the mail carrier, a neighbor walking a dog. Then at 6:18 p.m., the screen caught something. A dark sedan had stopped across the street. It remained there for almost 3 minutes. I zoomed in. The driver's face wasn't visible, but I could see the license plate. I wrote down the number. Then I noticed something else. The car wasn't unfamiliar. I had seen it before, several times, usually parked near our office, sometimes near the grocery store, and once outside the doctor's office where Evelyn had been examined. My heart began pounding. I called Frank again. "I know that car. Whose is it?" "I'm not sure. Don't confront the person." "I won't." But I already knew I had to find out. The next morning, I called our security manager. He ran the plate through our company visitor records. 20 minutes later, he called me back. "Mr. Hayes, that vehicle belongs to a private investigator. Who hired him?" "We don't have that information." "Find out." There was a pause. "Actually, sir, I think I know." My stomach tightened. "Who?" "The investigator was hired through a law firm." "Which one?" He gave me the name. It was the same law firm that had prepared Evelyn's conservatorship petition. I sat back in my chair. Victoria was under investigation. Yet someone connected to her legal team was still watching our house. That meant the note wasn't a random threat. Someone wanted me to know they were still paying attention. I went upstairs and told Evelyn what had happened. She listened quietly. Then she asked, "Did they mention my name?" "Not directly." She looked toward the window. "They don't need to." I sat beside her. "Evie, is there something you're still not telling me?" She didn't answer. I waited. Finally, she reached beneath the cushion of her chair and pulled out a small envelope. My heart stopped. "What's that?" "I've had it for years." She placed it in my hand. The envelope was yellow with age. My name was written across the front. My handwriting, I stared at it. "I don't remember this." "You weren't supposed to." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" Evelyn took a slow breath. "James gave it to me." The room seemed to become colder. "James," she nodded, "before he died." I thought about my closest friend. James had been part of our lives for decades. He had attended our anniversary dinners, helped me through business problems, and knew things about my company that even some employees didn't know. "Why would James give you a letter for me?" "Because he was worried." "About what?" Evelyn looked directly at me. "Victoria." I couldn't speak. She continued. "James discovered something about the company before he died." "What?" "I don't know everything." "Then what do you know?" "He told me that if anything happened to him, I should give you this." I looked down at the envelope. My hands were trembling. "Why didn't you give it to me before?" "Because Victoria found out that James had been asking questions." I stared at her. "What questions?" "About money leaving the company." The room went silent. I suddenly remembered something James had said 6 months before his death. He had called me late one evening. He sounded nervous. I'd asked him what was wrong. He had simply said, "Richard, check the old accounts." At the time, I thought he was talking about a business mistake. Maybe he had been trying to warn me. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten page. There were only 3 lines. Asterisk asterisk Richard, if you're reading this, don't trust the reports. Asterisk 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 look at the original accounts from 12 years ago. Asterisk 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 the money trail begins long before Victoria. Asterisk asterisk I read it twice. Then I looked at Evelyn. "How long have you known this?" She lowered her eyes. "Since the week James died." I felt the blood drain from my face. All this time, I had believed Victoria's plan had started recently. Now I understood something much more frightening. Victoria might not have created the scheme. She might have inherited it. And if James had discovered the truth 12 years earlier, then the person we were looking for wasn't necessarily my daughter. Someone else had been moving money long before Victoria ever became involved. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether Victoria had planned this. It was. Asterisk asterisk who had taught her how to do it. I read James's letter for the 4th time before finally putting it down. The money trail begins long before Victoria. Those words wouldn't leave my mind. I had spent weeks believing Victoria was the center of everything. Now, I was beginning to understand that she might have only been one piece of something much larger. Evelyn sat quietly across from me. "What are you going to do?" "Find the old accounts." She nodded. "James told you where to look." "Yes." "Then look." I called Frank and asked him to come to the house. When he arrived, I showed him the letter. He read it without speaking. Then he looked up. Do you have access to the archived financial records? Some of them. How far back? 12 years electronically. Older records are stored off-site. Frank nodded. Then we start with the electronic records. We went downstairs to my study. I opened the company's accounting system and began searching through archived transactions. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Millions of dollars moved through Hayes Construction every year. Suppliers were paid. Contractors were reimbursed. Equipment was purchased. Payroll was processed. A legitimate business generates thousands of transactions. Finding one suspicious payment in that ocean wasn't easy, but James had left me a clue: the old accounts. I searched for transactions involving unusual vendor names. Nothing. Then Frank asked a question. Who handled the company books 12 years ago? I thought for a moment. Margaret Lewis. Frank looked at me. Is she still alive? Yes. Where is she? Retired in Arizona. He nodded. Call her. I did. Margaret answered after several rings. Richard, her voice sounded surprised. I haven't heard from you in years. I need your help. There was a pause. Is this about James? My heart stopped. Why would you ask that? Because James called me before he died. I sat down. What did he say? He asked about some old transfers. What transfers? Payments that were classified as consulting expenses. I looked at Frank. He immediately started writing. Do you remember the company names? Margaret hesitated. I remember one. She gave me the name. It meant nothing to me, but Frank recognized it. He immediately opened his laptop. That company was dissolved 11 years ago. Why would Hayes Construction have paid them? Frank shook his head. That's the question. Margaret continued. James thought the company was connected to someone inside Hayes Construction. Who? I don't know. Did he? He suspected someone. Who? She was silent for several seconds. Then she said something that made the room feel smaller. Your father. I couldn't breathe. My father. James never accused him directly. He said he needed more evidence. My father had been dead for almost 20 years. He had founded Hayes Construction before handing the company over to me. The idea that he could somehow be connected to missing money seemed impossible. But then I remembered something. After my father died, there had been a period when several outside consultants suddenly appeared around the company. I had been young, focused on expansion. I hadn't questioned every decision. Maybe I should have. Frank asked Margaret if she still had any old records. She said she had kept copies of several files because James had asked her to preserve them. Where are they? In a storage unit. Can you access them? Tomorrow morning. I thanked her and ended the call. Frank looked at me. We need those documents. I know. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I answered. Nobody spoke. Hello? Silence. Then I heard a man's voice. Stop looking into the old accounts. My entire body went cold. Who is this? You've already found enough. Who are you? The line went dead. Frank stared at me. Did you recognize the voice? No, he stood. We're not waiting until tomorrow. What do you mean? We're getting those records tonight. I grabbed my coat. But before I could reach the door, Evelyn appeared in the hallway. She had heard everything. Richard. I turned. I'm coming with you. No, she stepped closer. James trusted me with that letter. I know. Then I have a right to know what he discovered. I wanted to protect her, but I also knew I had spent too long making decisions for her, so I nodded. All right. She took my arm. As we walked toward the front door, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call, it was a message. There was only one sentence. Asterisk asterisk, ask yourself why James never told you the name. Asterisk asterisk, I stopped walking. Frank looked at the screen. Evelyn's face changed. Because we all understood the same thing. James hadn't failed to identify the person behind the money trail. He had deliberately kept the name from me. And suddenly, I wasn't sure whether he had been protecting me or protecting someone else. We stood in the hallway for several seconds after reading the message. Ask yourself why James never told you the name. I looked at Evelyn. She was staring at the screen with an expression I couldn't read. Did James ever tell you he was afraid? She nodded. Not in those words. What did he say? He told me there were people around you that you trusted because you had known them for years. I felt a chill. Who? He wouldn't say. Why? He said naming the wrong person could put you in danger. Frank stepped closer. Then James wasn't simply investigating missing money. He believed someone had enough influence to hurt him. Evelyn looked at him. That's what I think. I reached for my coat. We're going to the storage unit. We drove through the cold night toward the facility where Margaret had kept her old company records. The entire drive, nobody spoke. I kept thinking about James. He had been my closest friend for decades. If he had discovered something that dangerous, why hadn't he come directly to me? Then I remembered the last conversation we'd had. He had sounded nervous. I had dismissed it as grief or stress. Maybe that had been my biggest mistake. We reached the storage facility shortly after 8. Margaret had already arranged access. She met us outside Unit 214. She looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were still sharp. I almost didn't keep these, she said. What changed your mind, James? She unlocked the unit. Inside were boxes stacked from floor to ceiling, old accounting records, tax files, contracts, bank statements. Everything Hayes Construction had generated before the company moved most of its records online. Margaret pointed toward 3 boxes. James asked me to separate these. I opened the first. The labels were handwritten. 2009, 2010, 2011. Frank opened another. Consulting payments. I looked at him. Those are the accounts James mentioned. We began searching. For almost an hour we found nothing. Then Evelyn opened a thin folder. She froze. Richard. I walked over. Inside was a copy of an old wire transfer. The amount wasn't enormous. $35,000. The recipient was a consulting company I didn't recognize. But the signature approving the payment was unmistakable. My father's. I stared at it. That can't be right. Margaret looked over my shoulder. It was approved before your father died. When? She pointed to the date. 2 months before his death. Frank took the document. Look at the account number. I did. Then he pulled out another statement. Different year. Different company. Same account. Then another. Same pattern. Money moved from Hayes Construction into consulting companies that appeared and disappeared within a few years. But the destination account remained the same. My hands became cold. Someone was moving money through different companies. Frank nodded. And whoever controlled that account had been doing it for years. Evelyn looked at me. Who owned the account? Frank studied the paperwork. We need the bank's archived records. Then Margaret spoke. James found the name. We all turned toward her. What name? She hesitated. He told me once. Margaret, please, she looked at me. He said the person wasn't an employee. My heart began pounding. Then who was it? She lowered her voice. Your father's attorney. The room went silent. My father's attorney had handled the estate after his death. He had also helped transfer ownership of several company properties during the transition. And more importantly, he had known exactly how my father structured his private accounts. I suddenly understood why James had never told me. If he was wrong, accusing that man could have destroyed everything. If he was right, the person behind the money trail had been someone powerful enough to make James afraid. Frank pulled out his phone. I'm going to request the archived banking records. I nodded. Then I noticed something written on the inside cover of the box. A date, and beneath it 2 initials. J.C. James Carter. I touched the handwriting with my finger. He left another clue. Margaret looked at it. What does it say? I turned the box toward her. She stared for several seconds, then her face changed. What? She pointed at the initials. That's not James's handwriting. I looked at her. What are you saying? James never wrote his initials that way. Frank took the box. He examined the writing carefully. Then he looked at me. Someone else put this here. A cold silence filled the storage unit. The message on my phone suddenly made sense. Someone knew we were looking. Someone knew about James's records. And someone had entered this storage unit before us. Then we heard a metallic sound outside. The lock on the storage facility's main gate had just slammed shut. We all looked toward the door. Margaret whispered, "Someone knows we're here." The metallic sound echoed through the storage facility. For a moment, nobody moved. Margaret looked toward the door. "That gate is supposed to stay open until 10. Frank immediately reached for his phone. "I'll call security." Before he could dial, the lights outside the storage units went dark. Only the dim emergency lights remained. Evelyn grabbed my arm. "Richard, I'm here." Frank stepped toward the door and looked through the narrow window. "I don't see anyone." "Then why did the gate close?" He didn't answer. Margaret quietly locked the storage unit door. "There's another exit at the back." I looked at her. "Can we reach it without going outside?" She nodded. "There is a service corridor." Frank picked up the box of documents. "Then we take everything important and leave." I grabbed the folders from the table, but before we could move, we heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from somewhere beyond the corridor. Evelyn's grip tightened around my arm. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed. Then someone knocked on the storage unit door. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Nobody spoke. A man's voice came through the door. "Mr. Hayes," I recognized it. My blood ran cold. It was Marcus. I opened the door halfway. He stood outside, breathing heavily. "What are you doing here?" "I followed you." "Why?" "Because I found something." Frank stepped closer. "You shouldn't have come." Marcus looked behind him. "I know." He lowered his voice. "Someone has been watching my house." I stared at him. "Since when?" "Since the day I agreed to cooperate." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive. "I found this hidden in my office." I took it. "What is it?" "I don't know." "Then why bring it here?" "Because I think it's connected to James." The name changed everything. Frank immediately took the drive. "Where did you find it?" "Inside an old computer tower." Marcus looked at me. "Victoria didn't put it there." "How do you know?" "Because the computer was replaced before she ever started working with me." I felt my stomach tighten. "So someone had access to the office years ago." Marcus nodded. "And whoever hid this expected someone to find it eventually." Frank looked toward the dark corridor. "We're leaving." We moved quickly. Margaret led us through the service passage and toward a secondary exit. The entire time I kept thinking about the flash drive. When we reached the parking lot, I looked back at the building. Nothing moved. No cars. No people. But I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching from somewhere in the darkness. We drove straight to Frank's office. He connected the flash drive to an isolated computer. There were dozens of files. Most were old accounting spreadsheets. Some were scanned contracts. Then we found a folder labeled JC. Frank opened it. Inside was a series of documents dated nearly 12 years earlier. The first was a payment ledger. The second was a scanned letter. The third was a photograph. I stared at the screen. The photograph showed James standing outside Hayes Construction with another man. I recognized the other man immediately. My father's attorney, but there was something else. Behind them stood a younger Victoria. I looked at the date. She had been barely 20 years old. Why was Victoria there? Nobody answered. Frank opened the scanned letter. It was written by James. He had documented several suspicious transfers and named the attorney as the person who appeared to control the receiving accounts. But the final paragraph was different. James had written that he believed the attorney was not acting alone. Frank scrolled down, then stopped. "Richard." I leaned closer. The final sentence read, "Asterisk asterisk, if anything happens to me, look at the person who first taught Victoria how the accounts worked." Asterisk asterisk, my heart sank. I looked at Evelyn. She was staring at the screen. "I know who that is," she whispered. "Who?" She looked at me. "Your father." I shook my head. "He's been dead for almost 20 years. "Yes," she pointed to the photograph. "Look at Victoria." I did. There was something in her expression that I hadn't noticed before. She wasn't simply standing beside the attorney. She was holding a folder, and on that folder was the old Hayes Construction financial seal, the same seal that had been used on the suspicious accounts. I stared at the photograph. Suddenly, the timeline changed. Victoria hadn't learned about the money from the attorney. She had learned about it much earlier, from someone inside our own family. Frank looked at the documents again. "There's one more file." He opened it. The screen displayed a scanned bank statement. At the bottom was the name of an account holder. I read it once, then again. My mouth went dry. The account wasn't registered to the attorney. It was registered to someone I had trusted for almost my entire life. And when I saw the name, I finally understood why James had been so afraid to tell me. Frank's words stayed in my mind long after the call ended. "The account isn't controlled by Victoria anymore. It belongs to Daniel." I sat alone in my study, staring at the family photographs on the wall. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Daniel was my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, taught to ride a bicycle, and defended more times than I could remember. Had he lied to me too? I called Frank back immediately. "Are you certain?" "Yes," he said, "but there's something you need to know before you confront him." "What?" "The account was opened using Daniel's identity when he was 22, but the signature isn't his." I froze. Frank explained that the account had been created by Charles Whitmore, my father's former attorney, years before Daniel even knew anything about it. Daniel's name had been added as a beneficiary without his knowledge. The money had remained hidden inside the old trust structure, passing through different companies and accounts for years. Victoria hadn't created the original scheme. She had discovered it and tried to use it to save herself from financial ruin. The revelation changed everything. Daniel had been telling the truth. He had been manipulated by Victoria, just as I had been manipulated by the comfortable explanations she gave me about Evelyn. When Daniel arrived at the house, I showed him the documents. He stared at them, then covered his face with both hands. "Dad, I swear I never knew." I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder. "I believe you." His eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry." "I know." We didn't say anything else. Some apologies don't need long answers. The investigation continued for months. The old financial records confirmed that the fraud had begun years before Victoria became involved. Charles had created the structures. My father had helped establish the original system, and Victoria had eventually learned how to exploit it for herself. Marcus cooperated with investigators. Dr. Mercer faced professional consequences for the false medical assessment. Victoria admitted what she had done and accepted responsibility for the fraudulent documents and the attempt to gain control of Evelyn's finances. It took time, but eventually the legal nightmare began to fade. One spring morning, Evelyn and I stood together in our garden. The roses we had planted were beginning to bloom. She looked at them for a long moment before taking my hand. "They're beautiful," I smiled. "You were right. They survived." She looked at me. "So did we." I spent 65 years believing that loving someone meant protecting them. I thought love meant working hard, providing enough, solving problems before they reached the people I cared about, and keeping danger away from my family. I thought that if I stayed strong enough, the people I loved would always be safe. But I was wrong. The most dangerous thing I ever did was stop truly seeing the woman sitting across from me every morning. I never stopped loving Evelyn. I simply became too comfortable accepting every explanation that was handed to me. She didn't disappear overnight. It happened quietly, in unanswered phone calls, untouched meals, closed doors, and little changes I convinced myself were nothing. That's the lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. Family betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, wearing the face of someone you trusted completely. But families can also heal when the truth finally has a place at the table. Clara reminded us to care. Daniel found the courage to speak. Evelyn found her voice again. And I learned that sometimes love isn't about protecting someone from everything. Sometimes it's simply about seeing them clearly before it's too late. So tonight, look at the people you love. Really look. Ask them how they're doing and stay long enough to hear the answer. Don't wait for someone to fight their way back to your dinner table before you realize they were missing from it. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you the longest, and let me know where you're listening from. Share this story with someone who may need its message, and subscribe to Heartline Narratives so you never miss another story. The stories on this channel may contain fictional elements created for entertainment, reflection, and inspiration. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And remember, sometimes the greatest act of love isn't protecting someone from the world. It's finally seeing them clearly.